Okay, good evening, everyone. As always, with a little bit of delay, we welcome you at our Friday weekly lecture program. And tonight, I want to welcome Bryan Gigantino, who is a historian, a Tbilisi-based writer on the topic of Soviet history of Georgia and post-Soviet politics in general. I'm sure he's gonna talk about his background experience a little bit more. And he's gonna present quite a questionable, by many people, topic as national identity with like some pinch of ethnocentrism that we can see in some regions all over the world, but in particularly in the region of the South Caucasus and Georgia. This topic is not that easy to deconstruct. That's why I believe this talk would be very valuable for many of us who would be tuning in. I think it's hard to balance the amount of trauma and post-Soviet heritage as many people perceive it, and the outcome of the years of independence, who became a big struggle and hardship for some countries. So it's hard to wrap up in something very solid. That's why it takes a lot of digging in and reflection. And that's what we will try to do tonight with the help of our speaker. As usual, as always, I'm gonna remind you that we are supporting Helping to Live an education initiative for Ukraine that deals with the evacuation to the EU and the evacuation from Russia of those people who were involuntarily deported to Russia. So we appreciate any tiny bit of help and donation to our donation box. So please keep it in mind and feel free to leave something after our talk. Thank you.
I can start. Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. Am I loud enough? Is this all right? Okay, everybody can hear me. Everybody understands English? I will try to speak slowly and clearly just in case. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I get a little nervous, so I'm sorry if I come across a little bit nervous. You know, I get a little anxiety when I'm in front of people. So bear with me. Before I start, I just want to follow something Paulina said, that the topics I'm going to talk about. These are topics that there are different opinions on, and so I'm going to present to you my own understandings, how I see the situation, how I see some of these topics. So there are people who have different understandings of this story and this past than I do, and so I want you to keep that in mind, and just as we go forward, some of these topics, national memory, the past, what it means, especially in the post-Soviet period, is really, really and really contested. And also, it's not always clear what caused what and why something happened. So I want to just, before I even introduce myself, say that. And the second thing is I'll probably talk, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes, and then I was hoping we could have a discussion. I don't know, we'll see how it goes, but I prefer discussion. I think it's like more interesting that way. We can ask each other questions and discuss things. So my name is Bryan Gigantino. I'm from California originally, a small suburb of San Francisco. For the past roughly 10 years, I've been living between the United States and the post-Soviet world. I spent time in Russia, spent time in Ukraine, and for the past 3 or 4 years, I've been living in Tbilisi after I finished my master's degree. on the history of the Soviet South Caucasus. And I currently work on a podcast project with a friend of mine called Reimagining Soviet Georgia, which I will introduce and discuss a little bit, and I will use that as an entryway into the topic. So Reimagining Soviet Georgia is a podcasting project where we interview academics, journalists, historians, writers about topics that relate to either Georgia's Soviet story, the story of Soviet Georgia, or how this Soviet story relates to the present. And in particular, like what lessons we can learn or not learn that sort of cut through maybe some of the more standard nationalist or anti-communist narratives, and try to understand it in a different way. The reason is because one thing I will get into this is that in Georgia today, there is a massive contradiction, I'll say a huge contradiction that exists. On the one hand, the post-Soviet national development has been very, very, very dependent upon anti-Soviet memory politics. Right? What I mean by that is that the memory of the Soviet Union is been systematically purged from the public memory in nation building. While at the same time, a large percentage of the population, if you were to ask them about their own feelings about the USSR, their feelings on Joseph Stalin, their feelings about the past, they might very well tell you that things were better then. You know, we lost a lot. And so how does this kind of seemingly contradictory dynamic, how can we make sense of it? And there's people who have some ideas, and so this is why we try to engage with this question in our podcast. Right now, and just one last thing about myself, and then I'll start say a few things, is that one of the themes that I'm researching now are Georgian immigrant anti-communists, and the way that Georgian immigrant anti-communists, those who either fled when Sovietization happened or earlier in 1921, had developed ideas about Soviet Georgia and what their relationship was to a broader global anti-communist, anti-Soviet communist movement in North America and in Europe. So these are the kinds of things I'm interested in, and how some of those ideas maybe relate to or don't how Soviet Georgians thought about their own nation, because in some ways they contradict. Any questions before I start? No? All right. Well, thank you guys all for coming, and am I understand it correctly, like some of you guys are students? Where are you from? UK. No, which university? Cambridge. You guys all study this post-Soviet stuff, or you just? Yeah. No. And other people were? And other people just heard about this event? Oh, nice. All right. No, great. That's good. Okay, so like I said, I'll talk for about I don't know, we'll keep it short and then we'll have a discussion. I like this more. So I wanted to start maybe a little bit in an unorthodox way. Excuse me, I would have my iPad here to read something. The first thing I want to say is that people have very different approaches to history. And I want to just start with a quote. Does everybody here know who Walter Benjamin was? Walter Benjamin. Can anybody tell me who Walter Benjamin was? Nobody knows? You know?
Intellectual of the 30s.
That's right. He was a German, Jewish, Marxist intellectual who killed himself as he was fleeing the Nazis when he was, I believe, 48 years old, on the border between Spain and France. He wrote one of my favorite texts of all time called Theses on the Concept of History. And so before I start this lecture about history in Soviet Georgia, I think I want to read thesis number 6, but you have to listen very closely. And if English is not your first language, you have to listen extra closely to this, and then I'll start. You'll see why. To articulate what is past does not mean to recognize how it really was. It means to take control of a memory as it flashes in a moment of danger. For historical materialism, it is a question of holding fast to a picture of the past, just as it had unexpectedly thrust itself in a moment of danger on the historical subject. The danger threatens the stock of tradition as much as its recipients. For both it is one and the same, handing itself over as the tool of the ruling classes. In every epoch, the attempt must be made to deliver tradition anew from the conformism which is on the point of overwhelming. For the Messiah does not merely arrive as the Redeemer, he also arrives as the vanquisher of the Antichrist. The only writer of history with the gift of setting alight the sparks of hope in the past is the one who is convinced of this, that not even the dead will be safe from the enemy if he is victorious. And this enemy has not ceased to be victorious. I know it's kind of heavy, but I start with this quote because Walter Benjamin, who was very influenced by Jewish messianic thought, basically understood that history is not a science. History is not what they have in the archives. History is the relationship between the past and the present about what will happen in the future. It's about the reconciliation of the past with the present. So what that means is that if any of you study history, if any of you like history, the most important thing about history is how, where, and by whom, and for what it is mobilized. That's what's important. So you can't understand the past, and you especially cannot understand the past in the post-Soviet South Caucasus without understanding how important the political instrumentalization of the past is. Right? That's what we call memory wars. So you've probably spending enough, how long have you guys been in Georgia for? 2 weeks. Oh, okay. And how long will you be here for? Huh? Till December. And you, how long are you going to be here for? Great. So the more time you spend, how long are you here for?
Always.
What?
Always.
Always. Great. The time you spend in Georgia, not only Georgia, but you see that memory politics play a very important role. How the past is constructed is actually a tool of how the state manages things. It's not actually, individual historians debating ideas. It's a political tool. And I think that this is a very important first step to acknowledge before you investigate any question, because it really is important. As things change, as the political situation in Georgia, in Russia, in Armenia, Azerbaijan, in the United States change, so too do people's conceptions of the past, right? There's a reason why, for example, not too long ago, there was a movement in the United States to tear down statues that had been built, praising segregationists, right? There's a reason why that when the Soviet Union started collapsing, certain segments and certain societies felt it necessary to tear down Soviet statues. It's because in those moments, the past is being renegotiated. Any questions about that? So, if we understand that, if we start from this understanding, let's try. Yeah, you got a question? That's exactly what I'm saying, yeah.
And you said that in 91 they started to see the past differently than in
How about this? Write down what you just said and ask me in 15 minutes. No, it's a good question though. But just wait 1 second. Because I think maybe I'll be able to explain it. Okay. How many people, I guess, in here are pretty familiar with the basic story of modern Georgia? Because you guys live here, yeah? Are you Georgian? أيوة. Kartuli khard. Kargi. So, here's what I'll start. I just want to, this is an impossible story to tell in 20 minutes. As you guys know, I cannot in good faith tell you the entire story of modern Georgia in 20 minutes, but there's a few things I'd like to point out so we can have a basis of conversation, okay? So don't attack me because I missed something, okay? I'm gonna just say a few things and then we can add in maybe where I missed, okay? In 1918, I'm going to start in 1918. Actually, I'm going to start a few years before. In the late 19th century, until the first Russian Revolution in 1905, there was a revolutionary movement in Georgia. Georgia was part of the Russian Empire. And as maybe you know or do not know, Russia had basically been annexed by the Russian Empire after a deal had been met between Georgian monarchs and the Tsar. I'm simplifying it, but that's basically what happened. One of the reasons why was because the Georgian monarchs wanted protection from North Caucasian Muslims, from Persians, from Turks, because they were Christians, and they had been for a few centuries at this point. The incorporation of Georgia into the Russian Empire had afforded many Georgian aristocrats a fairly comfortable position for two reasons. Number one, they were able to have a modicum of upward mobility, but number two, and most importantly, the local dynamics of the aristocracy were left more or less untouched. When serfdom was abolished in the Russian Empire, the Georgian serfdom had actually was able to continue much longer and informally well into the 19th or early 20th century before the revolution. And this arrangement, this comfortable arrangement between the local Georgian monarchs and the Russian Empire afforded the local aristocrats fairly well. But in 1905, the Russian Empire explodes. People here studying Russia, you should know that the Russian Empire had its first revolution, the dress rehearsal for 1917 and 1905. But most importantly, what happened in Georgia? Has anybody here traveled around the country and been to Ozurgeti? Ozurgeti is in western Georgia. This is in a region called Guria. Doesn't have the biggest mountains. and it doesn't have the most epic nature, but is a beautiful place, rolling hills, very quiet. And in 1905 in Guria, there's something called the Gurian Uprising, or the Declaration of the Gurian Republic, where there's a peasant insurgency against Tsarism. But the peasants are waving the flag of the Social Democrats. At this point, there's already a fairly bustling Marxist movement in Georgia. But you have to understand that until 1905, there's one unified Marxist movement in Georgia, but people start to develop different ideas. Some people believe that, the Georgian social democratic movement should focus on the interests more or less of Georgian speakers, the Georgian peasantry, and for this reason, some Marxists like Noe Jordania, who I'll talk about in a moment, becomes a hero of the Gurian peasants. Other social democrats, who you guys might know, someone by the name of Joseph Zhugashvili, who will later be known as Stalin, starts to see things slightly different. His mentor, Lado Ketskoveli, and others have a different idea of what socialism means, right? They start to follow the ideas being elucidated in Petrograd by Lenin, and as a split happens in the Russian social democratic Marxist movement, some follow a group called the Bolsheviks and some follow the Mensheviks. But what's confusing is that in Georgia, the social democrats were more or less similar to the Bolsheviks entirely early on, and they didn't exactly follow the split. Why is this important? What does this have to do with anything? In 1907, the Menshevik wing, under the leadership of a guy whose name is Noe Jordania, who is a polemical writer, he had studied in Poland, he's a Marxist, he basically becomes the patron, the grandfather of Marxism in Georgia. Stalin and some of his people who had been fighting with Jordania for control over the institutions of Georgian social democracy, he loses out and he flees to Baku. Lenin says, you should go do your underground revolutionary work in Baku. Why? Because Baku is home to an industrial working class. Georgia is not. Georgia is home to a large peasantry, an embedded aristocratic class, right? And this peasant socialist movement, with some workers in Chiatura who are working in mines and some other places, but overall, they don't have this base. So this split, and of course, a famous quote I always like to say is in the 1940, Stalin is asked, by a famous Georgian actor, I think his name is Vacharadze, he's in the Kremlin, and he says, why did you flee Georgia in 1907? And he says, well, Georgian peasants didn't he's Georgian himself, right? He's from Gori. Georgian peasants didn't understand me because, people with full bellies don't understand those who are hungry, right? This critique of the Georgian peasant socialism, where every worker who worked in a factory tended to have a relationship to a village, tended to have plots of land, and in a very different condition than the imagination of an industrialized Marxism that was developing in the industrial centers of the Russian Empire, all the way from Petrograd to Warsaw and beyond. When the Russian Revolution happens, what happens in Georgia? Does anybody know? In 1917? Does anybody know what happens in Georgia? Nobody knows. I know you know. In 1918, Georgia declares independence. But it doesn't just declare independence. Noe Jordania, who the 1905 Gurian peasants were celebrating, because Noe Jordania is from Guria, who Stalin had been in arguments with, polemical Marxist arguments with in Georgian Marxist newspapers, he and his side declare independence and come into control of what they will declare as the Democratic Republic of Georgia, or Yeah, the Georgian Democratic Republic. No, the Democratic Republic of Georgia, excuse me, the First Republic. And this is the first nominally social democratic state in the world. However, it's declared in the middle of a civil war. Armenia also declares independence reluctantly. Azerbaijan declares independence. But Georgia is independent for about 3 years. This is one of the most contested moments in the memory politics of contemporary Georgia, the memory of the First Republic. What was it and what does it mean? So this is where we'll start. This is where the story starts. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the first president of post-Soviet Georgia was a nationalist by the name of Zviad Gamsakhurdia. Like other post-Soviet states, they had to decide, well, what does independent Georgia mean if the Soviet Union no longer exists? So they adopted the flag of the First Republic and the Constitution of the First Republic. In 1992, depending on how you look at it. And this will be the flag of Georgia until 2003. The First Republic was a socialist state in name. They took measures that were anti-aristocratic. They tried to disembed the Armenian capitalist class. That was a kind of alliance between the socialist elements of the independent Georgian state, and I would call them the ethno-nationalist elements of the Georgian state, which is kind of hostile to the Armenian capitalist class, because, as you will study in your time in Georgia, one of the contradictions of Georgian nationhood is that in a place like Tiflis, which was the name of the city until 1936, Tiflis had a very, very powerful Armenian capitalist class, just like in Baku. And the Armenian capitalist class was the most powerful economic force in the cities of Georgia, where the Georgians were predominantly living in the countryside. Their elites were predominantly aristocrats, more rural aristocrats. The First Republic exists until 1921. In 1921, the Red Army will invade. But, again, to understand how the debates unfold about this memory of the First Republic, in 1921, when the Red Army invades, what happens? There's a tension about whether or not this Red Army should invade or not. Azerbaijan and Armenia had already fell under the control of what will become the Soviets, right? The Bolsheviks, the Red Army. But in Georgia, these socialists are in control, who had been involved in the revolutionary movement with all these Georgian socialists, some of whom are in Petrograd, who are important in actually the building of Soviet Russia, right? Lenin, you guys know who Lenin is, I assume? Lenin says, we should not invade Georgia. And in fact, we need to have concessions given to the Georgian Mensheviks. We should create an alliance with the Georgian Mensheviks. If you want to understand Georgia, you have to understand this point that I'm getting to. When Georgia was brought into the Soviet Union, when the Bolshevik Red Army Sovietized Georgia, Lenin was arguing that the Mensheviks in control, the Georgian local socialist Jordania state, should be left alone, and they should create an agreement with them. And it was an alliance of Georgian Bolsheviks who had fled. Ordzhonikidze, an important name, never forget, and Joseph Stalin, Djugashvili, who make an alliance and oversee the Red Army invasion of what was then the Democratic Republic of Georgia, and what will then become Soviet Georgia in the middle of a civil war. This creates a crisis during the revolutionary period, and when that crisis happens, there's a problem. All the state who had been in control of Georgia flees, and a lot of them go to France, and they become a government in exile, right? And they will stay a government in exile until the 50s, basically. Kandilaki, I believe he was the foreign minister of the Democratic Republic of Georgia, is writing up until the 50s, okay? When the Sovietization happens, right, there's a fight, people get killed, the government flees. There's an attempted insurrection in 1924, gets crushed. But what happens? A lot of people who had been working for the state and Georgian Bolsheviks who had been in hiding come out and they start to build Soviet Georgia. This is an incredibly controversial history because in contemporary memory politics, and I'm going to bring it back to the present, the state's position in Georgia today is that Sovietization was an external force that was bestowed upon independent Georgia from without by Russians or by Russia with the help of their Georgian, I guess you could say, helpers, local helpers, I don't know what you want to, local comrades, I'm not sure what word we could use. But the dynamic of what that means in contemporary Georgia has gone through changes in the post-Soviet period, which is the basis of what I'm trying to get at. You can't really understand the memory politics unless you kind of understand what happened in the past. So when Georgia was Sovietized, many Georgians, there were Georgian Bolsheviks who participated, there were many who fled, there were anti-communists, right, who were against even the socialist government of Jordania, because another fact that I'm not so organized, another fact is that the grandfather of Georgian nationalism, Ilya Chavchavadze, who you guys should know, and if you don't know now, you should know in a week or two, one of the fathers of a gentry nationalism. He was kind of a early Georgian nationalist. He was assassinated by Georgian Social Democrats who were affiliated with Jordania. So there's in 1907, so there's a quite complicated story of this tension of these different ideas of what a Georgia should be and how it should be. So after Sovietization, then you have 70 years of Soviet development and Soviet ideas about what Georgia is. And you have tensions, right? And there are even tensions within the Soviet state and by different actors trying to make sense of what this nation will be. But the important thing that I want to get at, and I kind of want to use, because we could discuss what happened in Soviet Georgia, I'd like to, but I maybe want to open up for questions and conversation more. But what I want to emphasize is this question of, so what does this memory then mean of Sovietization as kind of like an external imposition into Georgia, while at the same time being so intimately linked to Georgian Bolsheviks and Georgian revolutionaries? How does that kind of contradiction, how is that remembered and made sense of? Well, when the Soviet Union collapsed, as I said, the flag of the First Republic was taken on and the Constitution was taken on by the first government of Zviad Gamsahurdia, and then really made official when the former first secretary of the Georgian Communist Party and the final foreign minister of the Soviet Union, Edward Shevardnadze, returns after a coup overthrows Gamsahurdia in 1992. And in this period, the state was in such crisis that they didn't really have time for all this memory politics stuff. We just have to have a state. Our state's dismembered, right? The autonomous regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia and even Adjara are being there's separatists in these regions. We don't know if they're going to be part of our state or not. There's civil war, there's ethnic conflict. Georgia had one of the highest levels of economic conditions in the Soviet period and had the starkest decline. So if you understand the whole 16 former Union republics of the Soviet Union, Tajikistan, for example, had a lower living standard in the USSR, and that low living standard decreased when the USSR collapsed. Georgia had a much higher living standard than Tajikistan, but then went down to Tajik levels when the Soviet Union collapsed. So this was incredibly jarring for the Soviet Georgian population. And the reason that it happened this way is because Georgia had a very good position, what some might call the privileged republic, which we can discuss, I think, in conversation. In 2003, after years of this unyielding crisis of the state and of trying to sort of piece together a state, of Edward Shevardnadze, who was president, trying to figure out whether Georgia was going to have relations with Russia, how they were going to, then he's trying to get them to be closer to the United States because Shevardnadze had been very intimately involved in negotiating the end of the Cold War as Gorbachev, who recently died, as you guys know, Gorbachev's final foreign minister. Edward Shevardnadze was a reformer, a liberal, and a pro-Western guy, but he had inherited this very, 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 very deep crisis of Georgian sovereignty, Georgian statehood, and the Georgian nation. So one of the universal factors of post-Soviet statehood is corruption. And why is that the case? Well, when your entire economy collapses and you don't have a logic for putting it back together, corruption takes place, right? Corruption also existed in the Soviet Union, and in Georgia was arguably the quote-unquote most corrupt of any republic because the black market was so pronounced. So Georgia had a bigger black market than any other Union republic in the USSR, more ruble millionaires than any other in the USSR, more people who were able to siphon kind of funds. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, this black market kind of came to the surface. Shevardnadze was in charge of trying to sort of piece things together. But in 2002, 2003, discontent starts to emerge. And the reason that discontent starts to emerge is because there had been a decade of crisis. And things didn't really look like they were getting much better. Some things were stabilizing, but things didn't look like they were getting much better. This is one of the key points, I'm trying to condense everything, but this is one of the key points, is that in 2003 you have something called the Rose Revolution. And you cannot understand contemporary Georgian politics, you cannot understand how Georgians imagine the Soviet past without understanding what happened in 2003. It was the first or the second, depending on how you frame it, color revolution in the post-Soviet space. What is a color revolution? Well, a color revolution are these kind of civic uprisings that rely on nonprofit organizations and nonprofit initiatives that from the West in the post-Soviet space. They're not conspiracies, right, like some might say, but they're also not entirely natural grassroots uprisings. Okay, they're not either one, in my opinion. There's something else. The Rose Revolution was quite a clear example of that, where an emergent nonprofit complex of nonprofits in civil society in Georgia had been starting to organize and plan with sort of looking at what was going on in Serbia, because there had been a huge anti-Milosevic movement in Serbia called Otpor, and some of the same strategies and nonprofits and kind of Western institutions had been funding and sort of supporting similar initiatives in Georgia. And so through these kind of Western organized initiatives and through the emergence of something called the United National Movement and a charismatic politician named Mikhail Saakashvili, there will be a anti-Shevardnadze movement that demands his resignation. But the key to understanding this movement in 2003 is that Shevardnadze is also already pro-West. He's already trying to get Georgia into NATO. He's already trying to integrate Georgia into Western institutions. But that forces the movement then to positions itself as being more pro-Western than Shevardnadze. He's not Western enough. So what you get is an immediate instrumentalization of anti-Soviet memory politics, anti-socialist memory politics, and one of the reasons for that is that in this post-Soviet moment, the United States is what we would call the global hegemon at the moment. So the reformers in Georgia look to the patronage of the United States as a very important factor in how their own nationhood gets imagined. This is my position or idea. And that shapes how they start to conceptualize what happens. So what I mean by that is that they let go of the flag of the First Republic. The first independent Georgian state, they let go of the flag. Why? They bring a flag of what we could call a sort of Christian crusader flag, which is a flag with crosses on it, as a way to sort of paint the Soviet past and the atheist Soviet past as a slip of Georgia's long Christian and Western and European history. How can Georgia present itself as being a natural, endemic part of the West? And that was a strategy that was very important to the Rose revolutionaries. But the point that I'm trying to make here, and that is for the purpose of our conversation, is that a key part of that was to purge the memory of the Soviet Union from the public consciousness as being in any way, shape, or form a positive experience. Why? And this is something that we can discuss. The way I kind of see it is that the Soviet past had been so good in Georgia, the economic conditions had been so good, that there was a fear among this emergent pro-Western kind of constituency that the possibility of a kind of revanchist pro-Sovietism could at any point come back, especially considering the fact that a sort of deeply rooted cult of Joseph Stalin, because he was Georgian, and so many people had seen their conditions decrease, and that the constituency of the Rose revolutionaries was the younger, globalized, pro-Western citizen who had no fetters of Soviet person in their brain. That was the way that they imagined it. That if we're going to be a globalized state, we need to destroy and sort of purge this memory. But what came along with it were very extreme market reforms, right? The most extreme market reforms of any country in the post-Soviet world, because Georgia was competing with other countries for foreign direct investment. So the anti-Soviet memory politics, and even, I would say deeper, the hostility to socialism became an important tool for how this new Georgian nation was imagined. Now, that's a lot. But it didn't come from nowhere. In exile, there were plenty of Georgians who had been figures in the First Republic who viewed Sovietization as an occupation, right? In the 20s and 30s, people were writing, that the Soviets, the Russians had occupied Georgia. But in 2008, when the war between Georgia and Russia happened again, this became an even more emotionally connected issue. In 2006, the government opened up the Museum of Soviet Occupation on Rustaveli Avenue, right? Which was to say that the Georgian Bolsheviks were traitors, that the real nation had been destroyed by the occupation of the Red Army. But in 2008, when the war breaks out between Russia and Georgia over South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which is a very complicated situation that we could discuss, but I don't think I have time to give you all the necessary background to do an appropriate telling of the story. but for our purposes, that war, when the Russian soldiers occupy Poti and Gori for a period of, I think, 3 or 4 days, and then the French negotiated withdrawal happens, the sentiment that Russia, that the Soviet experience was an occupation and an external imposition on Georgians, on the Georgian nation, becomes deeply important to how people start to imagine and see why the war is happening in the first place. Nonprofit organizations, the state, Western governments, civil society actors, our academics, work together to sort of construct this narrative. And it becomes resonant. This is why I started with the Walter Benjamin quote. It becomes resonant because of the war and the tensions that have been building with Russia, between the regime of Mikhail Saakashvili and the United National Movement, the nonprofit organizations and civil society, and the regime of Vladimir Putin and the Russian state. The final thing I guess I will say, because I've said a lot and I'd prefer to actually have a conversation, is that this process of making that purging and that disremembrance, I call it, of the Soviet past central to how the Georgian post-Soviet state will be built, takes on institutional forms, right? Whether that's in the universities, in the nonprofit sector, how historians write about what is considered appropriate discussion, and how, because of the contemporary tensions with Russia, what is considered traitorous or legitimate historical inquiry and not. After 2012, as you know, the government came into power, which is the current government, Georgian Dream. And I'm not going to necessarily assess whether that's good or bad, or we could discuss that. But one of the, I guess, interesting things that happens is that some of the anti-Soviet memory politics starts to slow down over the past 10 years. You start to see, for example, new statues of Joseph Stalin emerge. You start to see a little bit more openness with some of the sort of Soviet memory politics. And the question is, like, who's doing this? Well, there are people in society in Georgia who basically have not seen any benefits over the economic development that has happened in the country for the past 30 years, right? They're culturally conservative. They don't necessarily have anything to do with some of the sort of, like, social liberalism of the West. They view the loss of the Soviet past not as a pro-Russian thing, but as, the loss of maybe their job, their stability, meaning. And so there's been a sort of like emergence of some of these segments of Georgian society that have started to be more open and public. But again, it's still quite marginal, at least publicly. But if you look at the polling, depending on the particular moment, people will answer things differently, right? There's plenty of studies, and if you want, after this, we can get an email list. I can send you every kind of study you want. Anything you want. There's tons of studies. Every year they're polling people, asking Georgians what is their opinion on the Soviet past. What do they think about Joseph Stalin? What do they think about this stuff? And very often, depending on how the question is answered, people will say things like, yeah, I mean, he was a great man. I'm pro-West, but Stalin was a great man. Or, yeah, we should of course join NATO, but Soviet Union was good. And I think that there's a huge tension about this historical memory in the country based on whether or not this Soviet past was a positive thing, and its going away represents loss, or if it's a regressive vestige of Russian occupation. And so I will end on the idea that my view is that because of this tension and because of the anti-Soviet memory politics, it's very difficult to have open, honest discussions in Georgia in different languages, because of course the society is quite segregated linguistically, both in the Georgian language sphere and English language sphere, and even probably in the Russian language, way. And I didn't even go off of my outline. I just had a whole outline I wrote. Anyway, that's kind of what I wanted to end on. And there's a lot of other things. I didn't even touch on the what happened in the Soviet past, because there's a whole story of how Georgian nationhood developed within the USSR. But because I've talked for like 20 or 30 minutes now, I kind of wanted to maybe open up for discussion, comments, questions. And also, if you have a response or a thought, you don't even have to have a question. You just have a comment. Please.
The only thing is that we need to use the mic for the questions all the time.
Yeah.
So.
What's your name?
My name is Vera.
Vera, okay.
Yeah. The question is, how do you see the Ukraine war will play out in this anti-Soviet manner?
Can you explain a little bit more? Maybe give a little bit more.
You very interestingly pointed out how 2008 war played out, or how this was used. And do you think this war will enhance those sentiments? Anti-Soviet, anti-Russian sentiments in Georgia?
I'm so sorry. Could you just speak a little bit louder, because I don't. Yeah.
Mask.
No. I could hear you, but I don't think anybody else could hear you. Yeah. Yeah. If you could just speak, I could already heard you. Could you just speak this way?
So my question was about the wars with Russia. So, as you said in 2008, the war between Russia and Georgia. In that war, it was very important using anti-Soviet memory. Okay. Do you think the war in Ukraine will contribute to that?
Where?
In anti-Soviet memory.
Where?
In Georgia.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Thank you.
I was worried a question about the war was going to erupt.
I think GD is in trouble.
Yeah. No. Explain. Yeah. Why do you say that? No. I mean, I agree, but yeah.
Okay. So you also mentioned current government Georgian dream.
Yeah.
And you also said that during the last 10 years, maybe anti-Soviet narrative or memory was not that actively used. And you also said that people didn't see economic benefit all these years from being away from Russia.
Yeah.
And because Georgian Dream has its own problems with previous government and previous president, who has been a politician in Ukraine.
Yep.
Right, so many angles here.
Yeah.
And they were very lame in positioning themselves in when this war broke out in February in Ukraine. So I think there is a tension in continuing this narrative and anti-Soviet memory in link with the war and with Russia.
Okay, yeah, I'll answer this, and I'll answer it succinctly. And again, I'm going to speak honestly, so just take that in mind. So I'm going to tell you what I actually think. Here's what I think about this. There's two pieces of the puzzle. Okay, the first piece of the puzzle for people who are following, if you're following Georgian politics. Okay, one of the critiques of the current government is that it's trying to reproach relations with Russia, that it's got a policy of strategic patience. And the reason that this policy exists is there's different interpretations, right? One interpretation is because after the 2008 war, there's been a fear that if anti-Russian politics inside of Georgia get too extreme, that it's going to cause tension and spark another war. That's one idea. That's only one idea. There's a second and parallel idea, which says that the current government is economically interwoven both above ground and kind of on the down low with Russia, right? The center of the news, Bidzina Ivanishvili, who started the Georgian Dream Coalition, right, is a billionaire and has many business ties to Russia. There was, during the period of the United National Movement, a lot of Russian-connected businessmen in Georgia went to Russia or left the country, okay? Or were facing persecution. So there's a critique that they are corrupt and that they are trying to rapproch with Russia for material interests of the country. On the other hand, there's an understanding that they are trying to rapproch with Russia because of this genuine fear that if they don't be very careful with how the nationalism is expressed in Georgia, that there could be the tensions building for another war. Okay? Very complex dynamic. But there's a third point that involves Ukraine, which Vera alluded to, which I will expand on slightly. After the Georgian Dream came to power, like almost all post-Soviet states, what happens? Well, when a regime leaves power, no matter how much democratic development there's been, they start to persecute and prosecute those who left power. That's almost every post-Soviet country deals with this dynamic to varying degrees, not just Georgia. It's because there is a democratic development institutions not develop they didn't have enough time to develop. It's only been 30 years. So there were limits to how much development could happen in the post-Soviet period, given how serious the crises were in Georgia. One of the issues was that a lot of the people who were involved in the previous government, when they fled, a number of them went to Ukraine. And after the uprising in 2013, 2014, when Petro Poroshenko came into power and Viktor Yanukovych, the sort of more pro-Russian president of Ukraine, fled to Russia, a lot of the reformers of the 2003 Rose Revolution generation who had high positions with Saakashvili fled to Ukraine and took up positions in the government. Right, former prosecutor generals, Saakashvili himself was all these very high positions. So what happened? That created a tension between Georgia and Ukraine. A huge tension. Why? Because at all times you had a dynamic where the Ukrainian government's position was hostile to the current government in Georgia, which was doing everything that it could to hold on to power. So I'm not saying one is right or wrong, but that's just the dynamic that happened. And that is a hugely important dynamic for explaining why Georgia and Ukraine, even though maybe you could say the world believes they should be seeing themselves as in the same position, are viewing themselves in tension because the current government views these kind of exiled Ukrainian or Georgian oppositionists as a threat to their power. The second thing is that when the Ukraine war happened, I think, again, this is my opinion, but when the Ukraine war happened, the current Georgian government was very nervous about a war breaking out in Georgia. And so they tried to figure out a way, that was one reason, they tried to figure out a way to manage both a basically nominally pro-Ukrainian position and not, they couldn't act like a Baltic state because they're not part of NATO. So the Baltic states could close their borders, ban Russians, do all they want, but Georgia is not afforded that luxury. And the second thing is that Georgia is far too economically dependent on Russia. for tourism, for exports. And so if you look at a country like Turkey or a country like Georgia, despite the war happening, they're actually economically benefiting from not taking a harsh stance on Russia. And I think that that was some people thought this was, totally morally inconscionable, but from the position of a realpolitik, nation state, and sovereignty position, I don't know if the Georgian state really had other options, because they could do things like give them, aid and whatnot, but they also had to manage this very delicate situation. And so, during the war, Georgia's had no threats. The Russians have removed troops from Abkhazia and South Ossetia and put them onto the front with Ukraine. Now, at the same time, the Ukrainian government has been saying that the Georgian government has been acting on the behalf of Russia. And this has been a huge problem because for example, one of the leading negotiators on the Ukrainian government side is himself Georgian. Akhmariya, sorry, I forgot his name. Yeah. And he's constantly saying things like, he's saying the Georgian government is in bed with Russia, they need to be harsher against Russia, blah, blah. And I don't know what other position the Georgian government could take without economically sinking themselves economically, or really conjuring an aggressive rhetoric that they can't defend, because if Russia invades, they're not going to be able to defend themselves. So what else can they do?
May I make a short comment about that?
Of course.
The one that you said in the end. Like, don't you think that?
Sorry, can you do it as my
Yeah, sure.
Again, this is my position. I think some people would very much disagree with me. That's how I see the situation.
Yeah, just a quick comment about the.
What's your name?
Nana. Maybe this fact that many considered Georgian government's actions as pro-Russian is because of the context we had before the war started here. Like the fact that Russian-related oligarch is ruling the country informally was one of the factors why these activities in general were considered to be more pro-Russian stance than being a neutral player and trying to avoid being engaged in war of some sort. Yeah, that was my comment about it. Also, I have one question related to the perceptions about the Soviet Union in Georgia. Whatever you said about it, it's mostly, as I see it, the perception of the older generation in Georgia who lived through the Soviet periods here, and they might have these sentiments because they actually lived there and they get to compare different periods of Georgian history.
Exactly.
Like the Soviet period where they lived and they had more or less good living conditions, and they had these minimal opportunities not to die of starving, which might
Exactly.
be the case today in current climate here.
Exactly.
Also, they had many different sentiments about having opportunity, very simply speaking, for Georgian men to go to Russia. They often mention it that they could very cheaply go there and have interaction with Russian women.
37 rubles.
Which is a terrible thing to say, but they actually say it because they think it's a normal thing to say. But also we have this younger generation here who cannot compare the Soviet period because they didn't live there, but they can compare two other governments, government of Georgian Dream and government of United National Movement. And do you think, my question is related to the fact that they didn't live there, so once this generation changes, do you think it's likely that these sentiments will disappear? Also, the factor
question.
here is that Russia's attempt to, very forcefully act in their foreign policy. Like before war started, Vladimir Putin very often said that his dream was to reinstate Soviet Union. And do you think it was his personal ambition, or understanding that if the context nowadays and in this current generation, he doesn't use this opportunity, there will never be this opportunity to reinstate Soviet Union because simply there wouldn't be people who have these active sentiments towards it and they want it back because they couldn't feel comfortable as the independent nation and because they didn't manage to do it.
Really great questions, yeah. So yeah, I did. First of all, the first question that you had about these people who lived through it versus the people who haven't. Actually, this is exactly the reason why I'm fascinated with this contradiction about the Soviet past in the memory politics. Because in my experience in Georgia, both personally, anecdotally, and in the research, the people who lived through the Soviet Union in Georgia think it was pretty good. More often than not. I think that that's pretty universal. And I would say that maybe even the people who don't like for example, I've probably asked every single taxi driver I've ever had in Tbilisi, Kutaisi, Batumi, Ozurgeti, doesn't matter, there's Rustavi, and ask them, if they're over 45 or something, how was it, right? And even if people say, well, there was no freedom and you couldn't do this, you couldn't do that, that people will remember fondly not just nostalgia of their childhood, but like this economic security. I think that most people remember this fondly because of the fact that if you look at the statistics, basically even during Brezhnev's period, right, when there was a thaw and when there was quote unquote stagnation, which some historians call this economic stagnation, Georgia had basically economically was doing much better than the rest of the USSR. One of the reasons for that was this big black market, the particular way the economy functioned, and the fact that Georgia had more freedoms, arguably, than other parts of the USSR, right? So that to me is actually quite interesting, that the younger generation is basically taught that the Soviet Union was oppressive, but the people who lived through it wouldn't agree with that. And so there's a tension about, well, then what does the memory of it even mean? And my argument would be that, of course there were bad things. Of course there's never been a utopia on planet Earth, So, but maybe what's important for the future generations would be like, well, maybe some of these social protections were good. Maybe everybody should have access to healthcare. Maybe, there should be more ethnic harmony, or maybe there should be, political institutions that manage the ethnic relations between people. Maybe there should be these kinds of things, right? A society where there's more opportunity for upward mobility. All these Georgians, had lots of upward mobility. So I would say that that's to me the interesting part. Will the memory of the USSR and social safety nets and this period of time die out with the older generation? I think that that's the goal. They want that to happen. That's the political goal, and it seems to be in the country, right? To remove this memory of the Soviet Union and hope that it dies out with the older generation. Basically, the way I view it is that there's a desire to stop the transmission of Soviet memory to the younger generation, cut it off, right? That's why you don't see a lot of that's why there's not a lot of young people who think fondly about the USSR in Georgia. Now, your second question is also quite complicated, but my position on this would be that I don't think that, look, the Russian state, and you guys are students of Russia or whatever, the Russian state is not trying to rebuild the Soviet Union. I don't think that that's true. And I don't think that and one of the things is that even Vladimir Putin's words, he's a politician. He lies all the time. Sometimes he says one thing, sometimes he says another thing. Before the war in Ukraine, what was his speech? It was a castigation of the Soviet nationalities policies. And now the position of the Ukrainian government is to defend the Soviet borders. The war between Georgia and Russia was a defense of the Soviet borders, right? The Russian Federation, I don't think, even though Putin is a right-wing revanchist and imperialist of some kind, he doesn't want to recreate the Soviet Union. And if you look at the way that the tensions with the former Soviet states have emerged, I think that they've emerged in particular contexts that have to be assessed independently. For example, I would not argue that the war in Ukraine starting in 2014 in the Donbass and culminating in the recent invasion is the same as why the war in Georgia happened in 2008. I think they're very different situations and should be assessed on their own terms. So I'm very against this idea. I don't think that they're trying to recreate the Soviet Union. And now, does that mean that Russia doesn't want influence? Of course they want influence. Yeah? Gas pipelines, trade, geopolitics. Of course, I'm not denying that. But do they want to annex Georgia? No, I don't think so. Do they want to annex all of Ukraine? I also don't think so. I think that there's a different calculation, in my opinion, personally. Yeah? Good questions.
Thank you. My name is Caroline, and I'm still wondering why you argue that in 91 people saw their past differently than they did in 88 and 85, and not that in 91 the feelings that they had for the restriction of political freedoms could come out, and thus they did come out.
Yeah. I think that there's probably two events. This is a really good question, and I just, for the sake of the lecture, there are two events that I did not mention that I think can answer your question. Okay. To understand how Georgian nationalism and a desire for independence, and I say independence in quotes because what independence actually means will go through transformations, will change and go through changes in the Soviet period. Scholars today generally agree, Georgian and Western scholars tend to agree, that 1956 was the birth of the modern Georgian national movement. Does anybody know what happened in 1956 in Tbilisi? I know you know. No, go ahead, speak up.
The Soviet army crashed some sort of uprising.
Yeah, but what was the uprising about? So, anybody know? This is a quite important piece of history. So, in 1956, 3 years after Stalin dies, Nikita Khrushchev undertakes something called de-Stalinization. Now, de-Stalinization is uniquely received in Georgia. Why? People start to go out into the streets and they think that this was an act of aggression kind of against Georgian nationhood as it was understood in the Soviet period. So people go out to a big Stalin statue that is no longer there in the center of Tbilisi, and they start to protest. And all of the people who formed the nucleus of the Georgian national movement after the collapse in the late 80s, right? Zviad Gamsakhurdia, the first president, Merab Kostava, a lot, and their names you should know, their group, they have their first protest in 1956 defending the Stalin statue. And a lot of Georgian researchers have done great research on this. You know, why are they there? Why are people out there defending Stalin? Well, a lot of them view it as like a defense of Georgia. Because why? Well, they removed Stalin, who's himself the greatest, most famous Georgian that has ever lived. There's never been a more famous, more powerful Georgian in the history of the world than Stalin. So that's a very huge point of pride for people. The Soviet Union was seen as, and you know, his circle had very high positions in the USSR. Georgians were doing very well for themselves. And de-Stalinization was viewed as a kind of threat to that position. So Georgian nationality and nationalism is kind of beginning to be understood in a way through the Soviet arrangement. That's the first thing. So people start to answer your question, people start to imagine, you know, what does it mean to be Georgian and what's going on and what does it actually mean differently when they have these protests and the Soviet soldiers kill people on the streets in defense of Stalin. No, people had always viewed Stalin positively in Georgia. I implore you to look into this question, but I don't think it matters. I don't think that was a factor. In fact, I just read a study the other day, a poll done in 2016, where they would ask people if their opinion changed about Stalin based on the repressions. Most people would say no. So I think that the memory of Stalin is more important to Georgians than the repressions. And there's people in Georgia who are trying to change that narrative. The other thing is that the repressions in Georgia were not nearly as bad as elsewhere. And this is an uncomfortable fact. Don't shoot the messenger, I'm just telling you. That's an uncomfortable fact of then, well, so then how do you navigate this idea that Stalin is considered the totalitarian and repressive leader, but then there's a cult of his memory in Georgia. The second event, though, I just wanted to say that this event shapes how Georgians start to understand themselves, independence, and Georgian nationhood. The second event are the language protests in 1978, where the Soviet state wants to change the status of the Georgian language, because the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic, the Azerbaijani Soviet Socialist Republic, and the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic were the only three Union republics in the Soviet Union where their national language was the only official language. And in 1977-78, as a kind of attempt to quell what the Soviet viewed as a kind of a threatening emergence of nationalism in the non-Russian peripheries, they wanted to change the laws. And there were massive protests in Tbilisi. Edward Shevardnadze, who I talked about earlier, was the first Secretary General of the Communist Party of the Georgian Communist Party. He was a liberal, a reformer, and he negotiated with Moscow to get them to drop the law. And it was the first moment, arguably, depending on how you look at it, one of the first moments of civic power within the Soviet Union being granted concessions. That also changes how people think about things. And then the most important event is, and you asked about how things changed in 1991, 1992, is April 9th, which is the famous protests in Tbilisi where I think 25 people were killed. Can't remember exactly off the top of my head, excuse me. But big protests, how they came about is why they came about is a longer story, but basically large protests that are sort of sparked in reaction to demands by Abkhaz Soviet leaders to demand secession from the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic. There had already been a nascent, burgeoning national movement in Georgia, and they used this as a sort of moment to protest for more rights for Georgia against the secession of the Abkhaz. And then the situation gets out of hand. The first party secretary, his name's Jombar Patiashvili, I believe, he calls in the Soviet armed forces to securitize the situation, and people get killed. And if you're a country of 4 or 5 million, nation of 4 or 5 million, in this heated emotional context, the Soviet Union is already starting to sort of collapse. Perestroika is going on, glasnost is going on, right? And in Georgia, people are furious that people are being killed in the middle of the street in a Union Republic that has seen little to no violence for 70 years. I mean, yeah, of course there was some violence, but I'm saying not people being killed in the street like that, with the exception of 1956. So I would say that when blood is spilled like that, these are transformative moments, and that then gives moral legitimacy to national ideas that I would say probably the majority of Georgians didn't really care about or were not actively involved in supporting, right? This is a hugely, but when people start getting killed, people start to change their equation, how they view the situation, right? In 1976, the New York Times interviewed Zviad Gamsakhurdia, and he said, I'm probably the only Georgian, there's a quote, I'm probably the only Georgian who believes in independence. That's how minoritarian the idea of Georgian independence was by the 70s, right? They viewed it very differently. Yeah. Hope that answers your question.
Any more questions?
The Georgian church is a big part of the Georgian identity, right? During the Soviet era, how was that? I don't know anything about it really, but was it totally suppressed, or were people still allowed to practice? And then when the Soviet Union collapsed, how was it like an overnight switch back to, was everyone all of a sudden big time Georgian Christian again? Or?
Yeah, no, this is a good question. This is like also like kind of it's kind of a complicated question for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, Soviet Union repressed religion from having political power. So the Georgian church was not able to kind of assert any consolidated political power. People practiced, some places more openly than others. Like I've said, Georgia had some more freedoms than other places in the USSR, so they obviously didn't tear down every church. And some people were allowed to practice. There were some like monasteries that were allowed to function. There's a very famous story of, 1965, a monk whose name I now can't remember off the top of my head, but I'll remember very shortly, who on a Labor Day parade in Tbilisi burned a huge portrait of Lenin and was put into an insane asylum. Monk, forgot his name. He's a famous, he became a monk, or became a saint. I'll remember in a second. Gabriel, thank you so much. Saint Gabriel, who was in Mitzcheta. It was because after he was put into the insane asylum, he then spent the rest of his days kind of in Mitzcheta, which is right outside of Tbilisi to the north, in a monastery. So you had these like acts of, I would say, like religious attempts at asserting a religious identity. But of course, like the Soviet Union developed Soviet citizens, Georgians included, who were non-religious, right? And tried to de-emphasize religion in their life, and tried to de-emphasize religion as something important to what it means to be Georgian, I think. That was like a goal, a social goal. There's also some people who say that that the highest rungs of the Georgian church were very close to, the security services of the Soviet Union, and that some of those connections maintained in the post-Soviet period, right? So you have a complicated relationship with the church, where on one hand, it's very important to the identity, but on the other hand, there's kind of criticisms about the role that the church played in sort of upholding Soviet power during the Soviet period in Georgia. There's a couple of articles that have been written about this relationship between the Soviet Union and Georgian church. Maybe you can look, one big problem that people see is this when, monarchs, when the Georgian aristocracy, of course, is trying to negotiate with the Russian Empire. One of the first, moves, I think that happens in 1820s, is the Russian Orthodox Church will try to bring the Georgian Orthodox Church under its control. But I don't know, but I would say that one other interesting is that when the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of people immediately became religious overnight. Some people had maintained their religiosity during the Soviet period, of course, right? There are accounts of people in the Soviet period having shrines to religious saints and to Stalin, in the same house, and to this day, maintaining this, this orthodox kind of relationship to the Soviet elites and to Stalin himself even. But I think that what happens is that when all meaning is lost, when the Soviet Union collapsed, people don't take this seriously. People are searching for meaning, so they turn to religion, and then not only turn to religion, but make it a form of their identity that had never been before. I think this is an important thing so the religiosity is just like overnight. Why? Well, because that Soviet arrangement is lost. That's how I view it, at least, and what I've seen. And now, of course, there's a huge tension with the state because how much power should the church have now? You know, and you can see that sometimes they find common cause and sometimes they don't, right? When the COVID pandemic happened, there was huge tension between the current government and the church. Is the church a force that can help Georgia integrate into the West, or is it a regressive force that's holding it back from sort of shedding some of the sort of social conservatism that doesn't sort of mix well with some of these Western values that the liberal section of society wants? This is questions I don't have answers to, but.
So I study I study a bit of international relations, and I'm very...
Where?
At Birmingham. Well, I do that for Russian as well. I was just wondering, so you mentioned earlier that the fact that the US was perceived as a global hegemon, that kind of changed the way that Georgia viewed its own relationship with Soviet era. And I was wondering, like, to what extent do you think that is? Because, like, I don't think you had enough time to kind of go into it. But I think it's just, like, quite a fascinating question, because I bet if you were to kind of, like, put blinders, for example, on a country, right, then the way that it, like, interacts and, like, probably, like, construct its own nation would be very different to how it would be, you know, when you place yourself in that context of a globalized world. So to what extent do you think that impacts the way that Georgia has been nation building?
Yeah. This is the question. There are so when the Cold War ends, the United States becomes what I would, for lack of a better term, the global hegemon. What I mean by that is that, they're the most powerful military in the world. They are able to have the final say in how, international financial institutions, the Washington consensus is being spread, right? Globalization is US led. The post-Soviet world is in complete shambles. And when the Rose Revolution happens in 2003, there had already been an emergence in Georgia of NGOs, nonprofit organizations, non-governmental organizations that were, some were focused on, pro-Western ideas, very famously, of what is now small, but it was pretty big, a group called the Liberty Institute, which was founded in the mid-90s, was pushing ideas regarding free markets, right? US-led, market-led, basically like anti-socialist neoliberalism as a useful model for Georgia's transition into an independent nation in a US-led globalized world. But after the Rose Revolution, more and more of NGOs emerge, and they have a very close relationship with the state and are very, very important in development of policy. And one of the goals of the Saakashvili regime is to make good on what Shevardnadze had started, join NATO, and integrate into Western institutions. And curry favor with the United States as a patron, militarily, socially, right? America gave more money to Georgia per capita than any other post-Soviet state. And then especially after the 2008 war. Now the question is, so this created what I would call a symbiotic relationship. On the one hand, this is important for understanding how it happened. On the one hand, the United States, after 9/11, had declared a war on terror, right? had pursued a very aggressive foreign policy, right? The United States and Russia worked together, blah, 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 on the anti-terrorist operations. But in Georgia, but what happened was that the Iraq War happened in 2003, and this was a failure, of course, at home and abroad, right? Millions of people around the world were upset with this, killed tens of thousands of civilians. It was a complete disaster. But the idea of the Bush administration was that, we're spreading democracy in the world. It's the same idea of we're spreading democracy in the post-Soviet world, right? But then, of course, you get someone like Putin is the outgrowth of that. Right? We're spreading democracy, we're spreading democracy, we're spreading democracy. And the United States has so many failures and is seen as an imperial power by so many people. Georgia represents the inverse, where the United States has a deep interest in portraying to the world and to its local and to its own population that Georgia represents the embodiment of American values in a world that is hostile to them. The United States is saving this country, and not only that, there was a revolution in support of it. Mikhail Saakashvili studied in the United States, right? The NGOs are all pro-America, right? People are waving American flags at the demonstrations, and there is a desire to become a client of the United States, right? It's not imposed on Georgia against its will, right? People are demanding it in the streets. At the same time, Georgia has an interest to portray itself to the world as a country that is moving beyond its Soviet past. So that creates a situation where how can Georgia say that it has a deep domestic national interest in being a friend of the United States? Well, we're going to build a statue to Ronald Reagan in Riquet Park that's staring at the presidential palace in Avlabari, or we're going to rename a street George W. Bush Street. So these kinds of things that are done symbolically, while street names and other things that have Soviet connotations are taken down, these kinds of things are done in order to show that Georgia had a long historical struggle against Russian and Soviet occupation and is a rightful member of the West. And who is the West at this time? Not the European Union, but the United States. And so there's a political strategy to sort of reinterpret its own Soviet past in a way that is curries favor with who's in power in the United States, but the right-wing children of the anti-communists, the neocons. Hence the reason why Saakashvili will say things like, Margaret Thatcher is an inspiration. The most belligerent anti-communist people, right? It's not because there's some inherent thing about Georgian culture that is against communism. That's actually the opposite of the case. It's the fact that this is a nation-building tool to try to restructure and get a patron that is the United States, and they do. That's how I see it. Of course.
Global atmosphere, right? Because if they're exporting and managing to gain so much economic benefit from having Russia, and then they're having this kind of political rapprochement with the US, they're kind of just taking the best of both worlds against it.
Right now?
I mean, obviously, I'm not a negative. I know very little about it. But
well, actually, I would actually argue something a little bit different. I would say that Georgia actually did not benefit as much as it could have from trying to be a client of the West. It actually lost quite a lot. Now, why do I say that? Well, I say that because one of the theories behind both Shevardnadze and Saakashvili had was that if we give soldiers to the US-led operations in Afghanistan and in Iraq, that they will give us NATO membership. Didn't happen, and probably won't happen. That's the first thing. The United States basically took over training for the Georgian military. And what did they do? They trained the Georgian military to be adequate for counterinsurgent operations in the Middle East, but not territorial defense. So they undermined the Georgian military capacity. What else happened, right? Well, one of the other things that they opened up the country to all of this Western investment and sold off as much property as possible, with the idea that they will integrate into a global system and benefit from it, but wages were repressed. A lot of money was taken out of the country. Foreign investors had no obligation to keep money in the country. Taxes were lower than anywhere else. This undermined the Georgian economy in many ways. And then now you see that there's you could say the chicken's coming home to roost. The current government is having these tensions with the role of the United States because, the U.S. was so involved in Georgian politics that it in some ways undermined the sovereignty of the country, which is obviously interesting to think about it in those terms, because we can obviously say that sovereignty is undermined by, South Ossetia and Abkhazia having military presence of Russia, right? But it's strangely enough that there was an undermining of sovereignty in the opposite direction, where the Georgian state became a client of the United States to such a degree that the U.S. had so much influence in the European Union in sort of managing the affairs of the country that democratic institutions, this is my opinion, a lot of people disagree with this, but this is how I see it, that undermined the ability to also develop institutions in certain ways. And now you've got a situation where sort of it's created a contradiction. Maybe you can take one more question. I kind of have to work do some other stuff. So. There's somebody else who hasn't asked. Do you? Yeah, maybe you too, and then we'll done. Go ahead. You first, and then.
Just 2 points about the Ukraine war.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I had to. Yeah.
I'm very glad that you said that the tension due to the high Georgian government officials who went to Ukraine was important in creating this, the attitude of the Georgian government.
Yeah.
Because that's almost never acknowledged. And very important, I think. Given the nature of the political culture where everything is about looking for enemies and trying to identify where they are. It seems to me that it's too simple to ask whether Putin wants to recreate the Soviet Union or doesn't want to. That it's not only a question of Putin personally, but there has been in Russia a tremendous outpouring of resentment of the West, which goes way beyond Ukraine. And it does remind me very much of the resentment in Germany after Versailles, and whose natural limits are very hard to know. And if you don't believe this, read the article by Vadim Sergeytsev called "Что делать?" It exists in English.
Хороший вопрос.
In English, it's "What to do with Ukraine," which is, as Timothy Snyder has said, a really genocidal agenda, the abolishing of Ukrainian statehood, the retraining over a period of a generation of all Ukrainians out of Ukrainian nationalism and so forth. And this is I think a tremendously ominous development in European history, which one shouldn't underrate.
Yeah. Do you have a comment? 1 second, I'm so sorry. I have a 1 second. It's not professional, but go ahead. Do you want to say, you wanted to, good comment. I mean, yeah. I'll just listen to both and then, oh yeah. The comment can stand on its own. It's
my question is related to the point you made earlier about foreign Western involvement in the protests in Georgia. Like you mentioned that in 2003 there was this mass discontent in Georgia, but actually what helped to get to some point and bring the change in Georgia was the fact that NGOs, foreign NGOs, were actively involved in this process.
I agree.
Nowadays, like as the person who lives in Georgia for a while, like as you mentioned, you were here for like last 3 years, you probably have been observing the developments here, political developments, that there is still some kind of discontent, but it's not going anywhere. And involvement, what I mean here is the change. Like the opposition parties and non-governmental organizations are actively involved in the political process, and today we have way more NGOs than we had 15 years ago.
Definitely.
And their involvement is way bigger. But
Definitely.
the thing is that the dynamics of the protests, they are changing in the fact that they are not getting their results in the protests. And what do you think is the cause of it? Like what social developments cause the fact that people are not actively participating in this process and not asking for the change? Do you think they are not anticipating something better to get from this protest? Like in 2003, they were expecting some change. In 1992, when the Soviet Union collapsed, they were involved in the nation-building process and they wanted to gain independence. And today, what they want? Maybe they are not expecting something better.
And 2007, big protest as well? Yeah.
What's your take on this?
Well, that's like a really great question. I think I have a couple of different thoughts. I think sometimes NGOs play a negative role in helping movements achieve political goals and develop a political imagination, right? And I think that one of the problems in like the post-Soviet world in general is that you have a situation where all social discontent gets funneled through nonprofit organizations. And nonprofit organizations, unfortunately, take social issues or real things that people are living through, and then either turn them into like the agenda of a foreign power, geopoliticize them, or kind of like make them the project of a NGO elite, right? So in Georgia, one of the big problems I see is that it's so poor. People are living in so much poverty. And then you have people who can work for NGOs and live in Tbilisi and have iPhones. And there's a huge distance there, right? Somebody who's living in a, on a 300 lari a month in Rustavi has very little to do with somebody who works for Open Society Foundation. You know what I mean? I mean, seriously. And so that has to be taken seriously. So how can a different political imagination be developed that focuses on people's social needs, real needs, right? What would happen if protests, instead of saying things like, never back to the USSR, instead said things like, workers should be paid more? Like, or for example, here's another example. The recent protests outside of Kutaisi when this hydroelectric dam was going to be built last year, right? Nachmanavesi, I probably said it. Yes, these were amazing protests, right? But what happened? The sort of geopolitical tensions and NGOs kind of undermined, in a way, the real sentiments and solidarities that were building between people. So, like, and this is a super complicated question of what happened. You probably followed it, right? But like, people in Tbilisi were saying you can't protest the dam because if you, or can't protest the hydroelectric energy plant because if you do, you're going to undermine Georgia's energy independence. I mean, this is crazy, you know, because they made it about Russia instead of concerning themselves with villagers and all of these other solidarities we're building, or what, you know, and then a much more touchy subject that's kind of complicated to get into, but we're all adults. The tension over pride. Because fascists tried to pogrom gay people in Tbilisi on July 5th, of course, you know, but then the NGOs forced these very conservative villagers to make a comment about what their position on pride was, which then split the protests. Because they were against the fact that the demonstrations were against this energy project that would have gotten an energy source that did not rely on Russia. So I guess the answer to your question is that you know, it's up to people who live here in local struggles to develop a vocabulary and an imagination that goes beyond just West or Russia, that goes beyond NGOs with their big accounts, and tries to develop, you know, grassroots political imagination that can speak to people's real needs. I mean, even on the question of the this question of like when they forced the right-wing villagers to make a comment about pride, all of these sort of more radical gay people in Georgia were defending them and defending the villagers until this moment where they made this kind of, you know, arguably homophobic statement about, you know, we don't agree that, you know, relations between men and men should be relations or whatever they said. And so I would argue that, like, you know, if the Tbilisi NGO elites had been avoided and if the geopolitical questions had been avoided, you could have had a real social struggle that could have made some serious changes and had a democratic power that could have started to really shift things. But it got destroyed. That's my view, I guess. This is a great question. I mean, it's really important. Okay, I can take like maybe one more comment and then I gotta stop it. You guys got more important things to do. It's Friday, you know, you gotta go.
So, one more comment or question?
Yep.
So,
Yep.
if there are no more questions, probably we're gonna wrap it up slowly. Thank you everyone for coming tonight and for great questions and discussion. I'm sure we'll have a lot of to dig into after this talk, and I need to promote a podcast that I was telling you a lot about, some of you, Reimagining Soviet Georgia, that gives a lot of perspectives on many topics that were mentioned tonight and were not, but very valuable and important to try to understand being, living, engaging with this region. So please check it out. I will gladly share the link under our announcement for the recording of this discussion.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Bryan.
And then thank you guys for coming and inviting me. And sorry, maybe it was a little bit everywhere. I didn't, you know, there's a lot to discuss. It's a very difficult topic. It's a lot of background, and you know, it's difficult to say this all succinctly. So, thank you for your patience. Didi Madlova.
Just a little reminder, next Friday we're meeting in the same space, same time, precisely 7 p.m. next Friday. With a new speaker, Nina Boyer, who's going to talk about our human rights network and grassroots approaches and community-based approaches to human rights community in Russia and beyond. She's a kind of a pirate from human rights sphere. So please follow the announcement and hope to see you again. Our donation basket is right around here. Thank you.